Hi, everybody, and welcome to Lesson 5.2, Development of Biodiversity. The content in this video is aligned to the third edition of Environmental Science for AP and is aligned to the CED units 2.1 and then 2.3 through 2.6. Here's our content objective for this lesson. Ecosystems have structure and diversity that change over time. At the end of this lesson, you should be able to explain levels of biodiversity and their importance to ecosystems. Describe island biogeography. Describe the role of island biogeography in evolution. Describe how organisms adapt to their environment. Explain how natural disruptions, both short and long term, impact an ecosystem. And describe ecological tolerance. This leads us to our guiding question. How does evolution lead to biodiversity? Biodiversity is a measure of the variety of life that exists either in specific places or globally. Generally, there are three ways in which we classify measures of biodiversity: by genetics, habitats, or organisms. Genetic biodiversity is a measure of the variety of genes and alleles that exist in the gene pool or reproductive population of a particular species. Habitat biodiversity is a measure of the different types and sizes of habitats within a particular area. Lastly, organism biodiversity is a measure of the different types of organisms in a particular ecosystem. This measure is one that most people refer to when they discuss biodiversity. It is much easier to see by sampling a population and comparing obvious differences. Within organism biodiversity, there are two additional measures that we can look at: species evenness and species richness. Evenness is a measure of the approximate proportion of the individuals in different populations, and is a good measure of whether or not an ecosystem is dominated by a single species. Species richness is simply the total number of different species that exist in a particular area. It is important to look at both species evenness and richness in order to get an accurate understanding of the biodiversity of an area. Biodiversity and evolution are tightly connected. Before we move further, let's make three things very clear. Number one, the use of the term theory when we refer to the theory of evolution is the scientific usage, meaning that the explanation of evolution is the sum of a variety of highly supported and valid hypotheses. It is as close to a scientific truth as we can get in most cases. Number two, because evolution is the change in allele frequencies over time, only populations evolve, not individual organisms. And number three, the discussion of evolution focuses on two different processes: microevolution, which is the process of adaptation, and macroevolution, which is the process of speciation. Let's take a moment to quickly review some terminology that is associated with evolution. A gene is a particular sequence within a DNA strand that encodes a single protein. The gene is transcribed into mRNA and then translated into a protein. Every gene has at least one allele, or variation. Alleles still code for the same function, but they may express themselves differently physically. The combination of alleles that an individual has is their genotype. The physical expressions of those alleles is known as their phenotype. Genes are typically dominant, meaning only one copy of the allele is enough for expression, or recessive, meaning two copies are required for expression, although there are examples of codominant and other expression forms. However, for our discussion, we will focus on simplistic Mendelian genetics. Organism genotypes are described as being homozygous, having two copies of the same allele, or heterozygous, having two different copies of an allele. It isn't unheard of for heterozygous individuals to demonstrate an intermediate phenotype than those of their parents. For example, a black mouse and a white mouse producing gray offspring. There are multiple events that can lead to evolution. It is important to note that evolution can occur through one of two mechanisms: natural or artificial selection. Natural selection is when certain genetic variations confer an advantage in a particular habitat, also known as an adaptation, due to selective pressures in the environment. Artificial selection occurs in much the same way, except that human choices and selective breeding are the driving forces of the allele frequency change. From here on out, we will be discussing evolution by means of natural selection. It is important to note that the biological goal of life is to increase fitness, or the ability to survive, reproduce, and have viable offspring. The majority of adaptation is driven by mutation, or the random change in one or more base pairs in a DNA strand. These mutations come in a variety of forms, but the end result is often the same. The vast majority of mutations are neutral and convey no positive or negative effect to the organism. Those that are harmful are often deleted from the gene pool quickly, as those mutations make it less likely for an organism to survive and reproduce. Beneficial mutations are much rarer, but tend to proliferate through the gene pool because these individuals demonstrate a greater fitness. Evolution, particularly in the form of speciation, is influenced particularly by the process known as gene flow and genetic drift. Simplistically, gene flow is the movement of genes between populations. It is migration. Genetic drift, on the other hand, is driven by random events that drastically reduce the population. This is often referred to as a genetic bottleneck. The result is a subsequent generation that is not representative of the parent population. That is, the gene pool after the bottleneck is very different than the gene pool before it. Another version of genetic drift is the founder effect. This occurs when a small, non-representative group of the original population moves to a different area and reestablishes a population. The key here is to note that the new population has a very different gene pool than the original population, making the paths of speciation and adaptation that are likely in this population to be different than the way it would have functioned in the parent population. Founder effect, along with adaptive radiation, is the driving force of what we know as island biogeography. This is the study and understanding of the relationship between islands, their size, and their distance from the mainland in relation to their species richness. Put simplistically, islands closer to the mainland are more likely to have a larger number of species than those that are further away. Additionally, larger islands are more likely to have larger numbers of species than those that are smaller. In this way, we can use distance from mainland and the area of the island to make predictions about biodiversity numbers and extinction rates. Biodiversity is also highly influenced by ecosystem disruption, resilience, and ecological tolerance. Disruptions are any event caused by physical, biological, or chemical agents that impact the population size or community composition. These can be periodic or cyclical, like naturally occurring seasonal wildfires, random, such as hurricanes, mudslides, and tornadoes, or anthropogenic. The overall impact of these disruptions are mediated by the resilience of the organisms or the habitat itself. More resilient populations better survive periodic and even random disruptions. Resilience can be understood as it relates to ecological tolerance and species type. Ecological tolerance is the range of conditions, either environmentally or internally, that allow a particular organism or community to survive. Tolerance is often discussed in terms of ranges of temperature, salinity, or pH. Broader ecological ranges allow for generalists to proliferate, making an ecosystem more stable to disruption. More narrow ranges lead to specialists, which are more likely to be decimated during these disruptions. Most biologists and ecologists believe that some disturbance in an ecosystem is good for biodiversity. This is what is known as the intermediate disturbance hypothesis. A moderate level of disturbance allows for a variety of organisms to develop and to make up an ecosystem. These organisms will eventually be those that have a wider variety of species types and tolerances. The following slide provides you with an opportunity to see how some of these ideas are connected together. Feel free to pause the video and explore the connections between these topics. Then use the statements at the beginning to review.